the nicest introduction ever. So sweet. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to Eric and Jane and everyone in the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department for inviting me to come here. I'm really excited to meet all of you and to be at UC Riverside. So I want to talk a bit today about some of my new work and a little bit of kind of how I got there. This talk is a lot about mainstreaming. I'm sure you all have noticed like kind of the mainstreaming of trans politics. I want to talk about that today. This image that is our start. I don't know if anyone recognizes this who's been to Seattle, but basically the Seattle Police Department has created these stickers, and it's asking all the businesses to put these stickers on their front windows. And the stickers say that this is a safe place for LGBT people. And if a business puts a sticker on the front, it means that they'll call the cops for you if you run in there. And as you might imagine, a lot of LGBT people and a lot of people in general in Seattle don't feel like calling the Seattle PD makes them safe. And the Seattle PD has been under investigation by the Department of Justice for its racism, its excessive use of force, all those things. There's been some really public murders of Indigenous people and people of color by the Seattle Police Department in recent years. So it's really interesting to watch this kind of PR campaign that uses imagery, this rainbow, and the idea of kind of this like door-to-door seeking safe space that kind of uses all these pieces from our social movements as a PR stunt for the Seattle PD, and other cities are engaging in similar things like this, I know. So anyway, that's what this picture of, and I think it kind of captures, in many ways, some of the themes that we'll be looking at today around how institutions recuperate themselves using like thin shreds of the critiques of social movements, and what do we do with that? How do we think about that? How do we deal with the kind of pitfalls of mainstreaming? So that's a lot of what I'll be looking at today, and I just thought this image, which is so, I hope it feels chilling to you. It's like, I always feel freaked out when I see it. Okay, so I'll go back for a second. So a lot of my work, as Eric mentioned, comes from being a poverty lawyer. Right before I was an academic, I was a poverty lawyer and working in a poverty law organization that serves trans and gender nonconforming people, starting about 2002. And that time period is very much before this current moment of trans mainstreaming, where we see a lot of images of trans people circulating in lots of ways. And in the kind of 90s and first decade of the 2000s, trans politics was extremely marginal, and a lot of its battle was even just like, could there even be a T in LGBT, kind of like, could there even, like, were lesbian gay organizations even going to like claim trans people, or still like say, oh no, we don't want to be like, have those people ruin our image. It was that was kind of where a lot of the conversation was at. And there was kind of this early moment of those organizations and that platform kind of adopting trans people a little bit. And the conversation was about how trans people and trans politics could just follow the path of the most visible, well-funded lesbian and gay politics, which had really focused on like anti-discrimination laws, hate crime laws, military inclusion, those, marriage, that kind of package. And so a lot of my work was like has been so far about the kind of pitfalls of that agenda. Why that agenda, why kind of a legal equality agenda, is unlikely to benefit trans people and queer people, people in general who are kind of at the biggest, in the most marginalized and most endangered situations, prisoners, people subject to criminalization, people facing deportation, people living in the greatest poverty. Looking at why that legal equality agenda came to be so visible and well-funded. So like asking those questions that Eric talked about, kind of the nonprofit industrial complex. How do we come to have those be the only queer politics we can think of, or the most visible ones, a lot of times the only ones people have heard of. And also kind of what that whole story tells us about the dilemmas facing social movements in the United States under neoliberalism. So like that's kind of like a lot of stuff I've thought about in the past and wrote about. And so today I want to share some very initial thoughts I'm having about a new project that looks at these moments of mainstreaming. So trans politics is mainstreaming in a particular way, and so is criminal justice reform. And as somebody who's worked for for the last 15 years or more on trans politics issues, trans resistance, and the harms of the criminal punishment system, I didn't know in my lifetime that I would ever see either of those conversations mainstream, right? It's kind of unpredictable when things like that are going to happen, when those moments are going to occur. And so we're witnessing these mainstreaming of these conversations, and part of what I want to start thinking about with you all is like kind of the processes of recuperation and mainstreaming and how they go together. And I think obviously in some ways when mainstreaming happens, we should think of that, it's often claimed as kind of a victory for the social movements whose ideas are, some degree of them are being mainstream. And we should say that it is a victory, because it is a sign of the strength of those movements, that they have to be contended with by the mainstream. But what happens next is actually quite complex and not always necessarily a victory, although it'll often be declared a victory by the institutions who want to quell the movements. So I want to talk a little bit about those dilemmas. I want to talk about kind of what critical tools we can use to ask how mainstreaming of social movement critiques actually ends up recuperating and supporting the very institutions that the social movements were trying to dismantle. How do we evaluate these moments of mainstreaming, and how do we evaluate the reforms that emerge from them? So mainstreaming, got a picture of Caitlyn Jenner, right? Kind of the poster person for the mainstreaming of transness. Mainstreaming often comes with, and mainstreaming of any issue, it often comes with new forms of visibility, conditional acceptance. If you can perform the white femininity described by Caitlyn Jenner on this magazine cover, you may get be accepted, right? The deployment of deserving figures, so the idea, oh, but we're like you, we're families, or we're hard workers. You get the idea of this hated group has some members who are worth surviving, that. And recuperative reform proposals, that's what a lot of what I would be talking about today. The harm and violence continues. So one of the things that happens when you get recuperative reform proposals is that you don't actually see the dismantling of the actual systems that are endangering folks. Instead, you see reform proposals that make things look like they've been all fixed up, but that they haven't really changed. And then the other thing you sometimes get is backlash, right, which enhances vulnerability. So 2 examples of this. I won't go into depth in this, but maybe we want to talk about this more in the Q&A, right? Like one example is Prop 8, right? So Prop 8 emerges after this lawsuit that's trying to get marriage in California, same-sex marriage in California, right, and get rid of Prop 22 back from 2000, right? So this lawsuit happens, which is designed to get, because California before that had, instead it had domestic partnership, but it had all the same rights as marriage, but it was a lawsuit just about changing the name of that to marriage, which already is like a very thin kind of reform. That, and then the result is this huge backlash, right? So you get this kind of like recuperative reform proposal followed by a backlash, and the backlash inevitably is most harmful to the people who aren't even going to benefit from the reform proposal, right? So Prop 8 is the rhetoric, the homophobic and transphobic rhetoric and violence stirred up by the Prop 8 drama really hurts people who are like having to go to the welfare office that day and having people in the welfare office, their homophobia has been really stirred by all this media stuff, or people in foster care dealing with folks working in that system, people going to the homeless shelter, people dealing with somebody at the convenience store and they're trying to use their benefits to buy groceries. Like those are it's interesting to also notice kind of who does backlash hit hardest, who's most vulnerable to backlash versus who kind of is running agendas for recuperative reform proposals. And then another example, obviously current example of backlash is the North Carolina, the bathroom bills that are propping up in lots of states, right? So we see this increased visibility of trans politics and this increased, I think, broader like long-term visibility of lesbian gay politics resulting in like this very trans-focused backlash that is definitely going to most intensely harm like trans people who need to use bathrooms in public spaces the most, right? So homeless people, low-income people, young people, right? It's gonna be targeted inevitably around people of color, people who are the least gender conforming, all of that stuff. So anyway, that's another piece of mainstreaming, and we can talk about that as well. Okay, so the backdrop to some of this work, I want to kind of share the backdrop to some of this work that I'm using to think about mainstreaming. So one critical tool that's been really essential for me for thinking about the limits of reform, the problems of legal reform, and how we kind of get to this analysis is critical race theory. I'm not sure if people here study critical race. Yes, some people probably have had a chance to talk about that in classes. Some people are probably new to that. But it's a large body of work. But some of the kind of, to give me the quick and dirty, ideas about legal reform that have been really helpful for me. Critical race theorists have talked about the limits of formal legal equality, right? So they've often talked about this when looking at, in the United States, in the period between the mid-50s and the 60s and 70s, racism becomes officially illegal in the United States, right? So formally, equality is delivered on paper. Yet today, when we look at like conditions, the conditions of maldistribution of education, healthcare, employment, income, housing conditions, we see that equality wasn't achieved, right? The racialized maldistribution of life chances remains fixed. And in fact, one of the big dilemmas critical race theory looks at is that, Brown versus Board of Education, kind of the most famous case in the history of like the US law can be redeemed, right, through good cases, is a case that supposedly ends racialized segregation in schools, and yet we see that schools are more racially segregated today than they were at the time of Brown. And that segregation is not just people going to different schools, it's also drastically unequal dollars per pupil per year in those schools, right? So that students of color are in the least funded schools and white students are in the most funded schools, and all of that seems somehow not to be illegal, right? Despite the fact that cases like Brown were one. So the limits of formal legal equality, that's just one example, we could find millions, is a kind of key understanding from critical race theory that really influences our questions about like, what kinds of legal reforms will help trans people with the like significant poverty, violence, discrimination people are facing? Will this do it? Another key idea is a critique of the discrimination principle. Critical race theory helps us think through why thinking about racism as a problem of discrimination hasn't worked, right? So how that tends to be focused on the idea of the bad racist with individual bad ideas who says you can't live here or you can't work here because you're a person of color, and how that kind of individualized discrimination principle doesn't work. And also how the discrimination principle is really like, if you see race, you're bad. So it's been used actually to get rid of things like affirmative action programs that see race, right, in who they admit to the UC system, or that see race in how they deal with school districts, because they're trying to remedy, right, severe racism and white supremacy that structures who gets to go to school, right? But if those programs see race, then the Supreme Court says they're racist. So the discrimination principle kind of dehistoricizes and depoliticizes an understanding of what white supremacy is and how to fix it, and actually ends up knocking down, the way it's used in American law, knocking down remedial programs that are designed to actually try to get at the conditions. A third idea that I found really useful in critical race theory that I've seen used by Reva Siegel and also by Angela Harris really persuasively is the idea that when the law faces social movements that are seeking to disrupt things that are unfair, that are unjust, what the law will do is transform just enough to preserve the status quo. So things will change on paper, or things will change a little bit, but actually be preserved. So one example of this, like a big example, would be that you see that there's significant reasons to be concerned about racial apartheid in the United States. So the law changes, and racial apartheid is no longer the law of the United States, but it's still the reality, for example, of our school system, as I described before, right? So that you see just enough transformation to preserve, like a new window dressing or a new cover story, right? But actually the preservation of the same conditions as much as possible. So these three ideas from critical race theory, very helpful for me for trying to think about the limits of legal reforms and the dilemmas and problems. Also, women of color feminist critiques of various kinds have been really useful for me in this way as well, and I'm sure many of you are also studying these. A couple examples. Critiques that are about the ways that the words got switched. Anyway, the critiques are about the ways in which using criminalization to address violence against women or gender-based violence like rape, domestic violence, sexual assault has actually expanded the reach of criminal systems and been kind of a justification for their sustenance. So rather than reducing violence in the lives of women or of people of color or people targeted by gender violence, they've instead sustained the very systems that most harm those same populations. So part of this is using a state violence framing, moving us to be able to think about things like systems of criminalization, systems of immigration enforcement as violence itself. So instead of the police or the prison being the solution to domestic violence or sexual assault, it actually is understood in these critiques as violence, right? That necessarily includes severe gendered violence. Another piece of this is that saving women becomes good PR, right, for police and prosecutors. This is similar to the first slide I showed with the picture of the pro-gay policing in Seattle, right? So the ways in which these systems have kind of redeemed their own public images through the idea of saving women or sometimes LGBT people. This is where the lost hanging clause from the first slide, let's just move on. Okay. And finally, there's been a really useful critique of institutionalization in the context of women of color feminist critique that says when you see a social problem defined, whether that social problem is rape, is domestic violence, is human trafficking, how is this problem being framed? What are the kind of racialized gendered assumptions? And who is being authorized as experts and who is being resourced to solve it? And especially looking at that, like who's being, is this being resourced as the police will solve this problem, which consistently throughout our lifetimes, police and prosecutors have been consistently resourced to solve it, or border enforcement or the military. So looking at how do our social movements raising a problem, how does that problem get reframed to authorize greater capacity for enforcement of the very systems that we are most harmed by? Okay, so for me, some of those critiques have fallen into critical trans politics by helping us see that equality, like legal equality reform proposals, are dead ends in many ways for queer and trans politics, right? That hate crime laws, which enhance the punishing power of the criminal punishment system, enhance prosecutorial capacity to imprison people for longer, or to collect more data, or literally like give more money to local law enforcement, are a problem, since the number one source of violence against transgender nonconforming people is the police and the criminal system, right? So the idea of enhancing that system in the name of saving us is concerning. And the limits of anti-discrimination measures, that, kind of the first thing that happens every time I'm involved in any kind of policy reform work around police and prisons, the idea is we'll just slap an anti-discrimination policy or measure onto this system. It does nothing. It does absolutely nothing. We know this because we've seen the enhancement of the racialized wealth divide in the United States during the same period when racism is supposedly illegal under anti-discrimination measures, right? So just having to face the realities that is, again, good PR, changes the window dressing, but doesn't ultimately transform conditions. Critical trans politics for me has also been about examining the limits of changing what the law says about a hated group versus asking what legal systems do to hated groups. So a lot of those kinds of measures, the equality measures, are about like sticking like gender identity or trans people's name on a law to say, these are good people, the law protects them, but it does nothing, as opposed to being like, which systems are actually killing these people, right? It might be the public benefit system. It might be the way that disability benefits are being distributed or failing to be distributed. It might be the policing system. It might be the public school system. It might be the foster care system. But it's less about trying to change what these laws say and look at what legal systems do, how they operate on people's lives and on despised populations. What kinds of discretion does the juvenile punishment system give to individual workers in it to punish trans and gender nonconforming youth inside youth prisons for their gender performances, right? That's like an example, right? And make them stay longer. And then third, a key piece of this for me has been attention to what I have called administrative violence, and other people have called administrative violence also. So how are racialized gender norms just like part of all of these violent systems we're concerned with, the immigration system, the public benefit systems, systems that determine people's life chances. So how can we, instead of trying to find a way to say, to slap on like a rainbow flag or whatever onto like whatever the system is, instead say, how is gender being enforced by these systems itself? How are racialized gender norms enforced, both at the level of the individual discretion of all the workers in that system who get to decide that day, who gets welfare benefits, who gets housing, but also at the level of literally like inside the databases of these systems, like what the gender marker does, how you change it, how you can't change it, all of those pieces. Okay. So just to kind of summarize the background of this work, a lot of this work for me has been about looking at the pitfalls of these reforms. Hopefully these are familiar by now, right? The biggest pitfall of these reforms often is that they don't actually provide any material relief. The basic thing social movements, of course, are trying to do is like change the terrible conditions that are killing our people, right? Like that is what they should be most concerned about ultimately. But a lot of times what they become concerned about is changing laws, whether or not that actually changes lives. And there's an assumption that changing laws changes lives that's just actually untenable at this point. So one of the biggest pitfalls of a reform is just like, did it do anything for any of the people who were in danger? Another dilemma is when the relief only can reach the least marginalized, right? That's a very common piece of this. People sometimes call that creaming, like it takes the cream off the top. If you have all the people in a population and then you just take the ones who are the least marginalized, and they get a little tiny bit of relief, which has been, so you're going to get a few trans people who get to like work in corporate America out of this whole thing, and that's it. They're going to be white and they're going to be documented and they're not going to have a criminal history and the people who are already like one step away, right? Or it's sometimes considered like restoring white privilege has been the way people have talked about it around gay politics. Like the kind of mainstream gay politics is about like just restoring white privilege to the wealthiest, most entitled of the lesbian gay population. Another dilemma is that it's just window dressing. It just legitimizes harmful systems. It's just PR for them. Right? Tinkers, it doesn't reach any root causes, or that it expands them. Right? That like hate crimes laws actually is more money to local law enforcement. And the other piece of it is that it just divides the population into deserving and undeserving. This is really visible right now in like the immigrant rights context, where it's like, relief only for those who have no criminal convictions, who have no misdemeanor convictions, and the expansion of the kinds of statuses that can get you to be in the undeserving category alongside the like crumbs of the DACA and DAPA programs being handed out, right? So that kind of combination. So I'm not going to go into as much detail on this, but what the new work is about, in part, is about, for me, picking up a lot of scholars, including many people in this room, have looked at the dilemmas between social movements in the U.S. or sort of targeted and hated populations and the U.S. Through a warfare framework. And a lot of the social movements I study have used a warfare framework to look at this, to say that the U.S. is actually at war with black populations, indigenous populations, or the various groups or the social movements that are representing those, and that part of what a lot of those groups do, and why a lot of those thinkers and a lot of those movements, why they use this framework of warfare in part, is because they look at what the U.S. does in relation to those movements, and they notice that the U.S. uses a counterinsurgency framework. So the U.S. government is seeing it as war. Police departments are seeing it as warfare, and that is actually an appropriate frame for understanding how the government itself is approaching our movements. And so counterinsurgency, is, by some people, is sort of defined as including two wings. Repression, right? Like when the government, infiltrates your groups, spies on you, assassinates your leaders, imprisons people, sets people up. COINTELPRO. We think about the ways in which the Black Panthers, Young Lords, American Indian Movement. We can see those stories very clearly in our histories, but also today's stories about the infiltration of Black Lives Matter chapters and many other contemporary social movement bodies. So that's the repression piece, and the other piece is this recuperation piece. The recuperation piece is part of what I'm interested in here, right? Recuperation is where is focused on picking up ideas and images from movements and incorporating them to prop up and expand existing institutions, and really focus on getting dissent turned into your participation in those institutions. So I'm interested in that piece. Couple examples just of the kind of critiques that we've been seeing. I forgot to show you these images. It's so heartbreaking and intense. This is a piece that I collaborated on with an artist named Talcott Broadhead to try to talk about the ways in which trans concerns about imprisonment can be turned into stories about let's build trans prisons, right? That's often the first response in policy conversations. And of course, the goal is to get trans people out of prison. So the framework the question that I'm interested in this new work is kind of, how do we know if a particular tactic or reform is recuperative? How do different thinkers, scholars, movements assess this? In particular, because I think a lot of critical work, like critical gender studies and sexuality studies work, just ends with a critique of what the reform is, but not kind of then what do people who understand the critique do on the ground to then navigate the critique and still seek various reforms? So I'm interested in how different people and different thinkers, movements, organizations are accounting for this question. Some of the criteria I've written about in the past and noticed in the past often, or some of the things I'm kind of drawing from it now are, does it provide material relief? Does it leave out an especially marginalized or part of the affected group, right? I just gave these examples, like people with criminal records or people without immigration status. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? And does it mobilize the most affected for ongoing struggle? So that is about kind of this question of, are there tactics in use in the organizing around a particular reform, even though the reform is limited, that are likely to produce greater people power among the people organizing? So an example I often use of this is this work in New York City that was focused on the ways in which the Human Resources Administration, which is the welfare authority of New York City, there was all this work to try to deal with the transphobia that trans welfare recipients were facing at the hands of the Human Resources Administration. A bunch of different things happening. It could be you show up for your work fair job assignment and they say, we're counting you as absent because you're not dressed in gender appropriate clothing, so then your benefits get cut off. It could be that your ID that you use to get your benefits has a gender marker on it that doesn't work for you, and then you're being told it's not yours at the store and you can't use your food stamps. I mean, a lot of different things. So a group of us had written a set of best practices for HRA to try to address these different things within their system. And they were, of course, sitting on them. They weren't going to do anything with them. And then there was also, at the same time, an organizing project. So this kind of legal project and an organizing project that was trans current welfare recipients. So very marginalized, hated group, right? Welfare recipients are super hated in the United States, trans people. And it was mostly Black trans women, welfare recipients. And they were organizing also to push through policy change at HRA. And they did all this amazing organizing together, and ultimately they won some limited changes to the policy, and they also made a palm card that they gave out to all the people that they knew in their communities who were other trans people on benefits to try to get them to know kind of what are your basic rights at HRA. The people doing this organizing knew it was a recuperative reform. They didn't believe that now everything was going to be great at HRA. They knew HRA is a terrible thing for poor people, and they had no fantasy that HRA was going to be a wonderful place now and all their work was done. But the method of doing the organizing to win this win built in like really significant capacity in this group of people to be organizers. They went on to be organizers in the campaigns against Stop and Frisk. They're organizers with Occupy Wall Street. They are organizers in lots of other spaces, and their leadership was produced through this. So I think another, when I'm thinking about these criteria, you're not just thinking about like the reform itself and what it will or won't get, which also is often unpredictable in some ways. How will this be enforced? How will it be implemented? But also, what was the process to get it there? Was it like behind closed doors, somebody signed off, and then some nonprofit was like, we won the thing, but then like the actual affected community didn't know about it, no power was built, no change was built in that way. So it's about both processes and the kind of content of the reform when thinking about this recuperation question. So these are the kind of like criteria that I've often been thinking about for several years. And I've been trying to look at like, particularly I've been looking at scholars who are not in academia, who are just social movement scholars, because they often write more, they often go further with this question than people in academia who stop often at the critique. So I've been fascinated by some of these social movement scholars. This person, Peter Gelderloos, he has this criteria that he's looking at a bunch of, he's asking, is it liberatory? But he's looking at a bunch of different kind of like revolutionary moments of the last decade or so. He looks at like Occupy and the M15 movement in Spain and just like various strategies and methods. And he asks some interesting questions. He asks, does it seize space in which new social relations can be enacted? So this is kind of a process question, like I was saying. He's really looking at like, did they take over the square? Did people get together and like make decisions publicly in a way that they'd never participated in before, right? Like in the United States, for Occupy was an interesting moment because most people in the United States have never been to like a meeting where a decision was made, where there wasn't like a parent, a boss, a teacher, a principal, like telling them what to do, right? So that's like an interesting social relation that got changed for some people who for the first time were in a big meeting with a bunch of strangers making a decision together. It wasn't like it all went great all the time, but like that's a different, interesting social experiment. Or when people take over space physically, like take land, right? Like, those kinds of moments. So like, were there new social relations? People feed each other. Did they share stuff they're not supposed to share? Did we get outside our like Netflix and, like Jack in the Box and car and, whatever it is, whatever that looks like here in Riverside, I'm trying to use examples, like Jack in the Box. I think you guys have that. Anyway, Seattle is different. You can imagine it's like, medical marijuana or something. Okay, so did it seize a space in which new social relations can be enacted? Does it spread awareness of its ideas? Gelderloos is really interested in whether that's participatory. So he's not just like, did you hear about it on Twitter? It's more like, did you start your own Black Lives Matter chapter in your town? Like, did people take it up and do their own with it? He's not like, just like, have you heard of it? That's not enough for him. This is the one I think is fascinating. Does it have elite support? It's really interesting. Gelderloos says, if part of the elite supports a movement, it is much more likely that the movement appears to achieve victories when in fact that victory is insubstantial and supports elite interests. That's a pretty heavy, important question, right? Like, when something, when we're questioning victories, especially if you look at something like same-sex marriage or some of these other things that have been declared these huge, huge victories, and then you ask kind of like, who has what to gain here? What kinds of elites got on board? Why? Why was this not threatening to their interests? I think it's an interesting question. And then he asked something similar to my prior question, because he says, does it achieve concrete gains in improving people's lives? So kind of the material support. Another person I look at, I have others, but I'm just going to give you two today because I don't want to go on for too long. Harsha Walia, she wrote this really useful book, Undoing Border Imperialism, that looks at the work of No One is Illegal, which is an organization across Canada that has chapters in various cities that does a lot of like direct support to stop people from being deported and also to like transform Canadian policies that endanger people facing deportation. And their work is deeply aligned with Indigenous solidarity. So their framework is no one is illegal, Canada is illegal, right? They're like thinking about and really enacting work on Indigenous like land and belonging questions alongside questions about deportation and immigration policy. She asks, has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? And when I read this question, I think about this story she tells, which you can also watch the video on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. Of in 2008, when No One is Illegal and a lot of the groups they work with brought 2,000 people to the Vancouver airport and shut down the international terminal to stop the deportation of a man named Laibar Singh. And it worked. He didn't get deported. I mean, he got deported later, but they didn't get deported for several years after that, for several years. But but I don't know that that's happened in the U.S. I'm not aware of that, that level. People increasingly now in the U.S. through the Not One More work are blocking deportation buses. It's something we've been doing up in Tacoma, and I know it's been happening around the country. But undermining its functions, wow, literally stopping the wheels from turning is an interesting kind of, her assessment, that piece of it, or diminishing its moral legitimacy, which is really important in the realm of the question of migrant justice, because there's a lot of work that isn't diminishing its moral legitimacy. Instead, it's saying, just deport the felons, not the families, right? That's like I'm using Obama's words. We're going to deport felons, not families. That upholds the legitimacy of the system, right? That people like Harsha Walia and the people in No One Is Illegal are saying, we want no deportations. We want to say this entire system is illegitimate. The Canadian government's ability to decide who is in and who is out is illegitimate as a settler colonial power. They're really thinking in another way. So I'm fascinated by her work. She's got that book. I really just recommend it. It's full of interesting stuff. So I'm thinking about in the book that I'm working on, I'm thinking about a number of examples where you see the complexity of trying to assess whether a reform is recuperative and how different organizations, coalitions, activist movements, thinkers are assessing that. And I just want to give you guys one example for us to kind of close with, which is this work around creating a New York City municipal ID. So this work to create, there was no New York City ID. There was just like, you get a state ID, like you get a California driver's license or non-driver ID, and then of course we all have different pieces of federal ID and all that. But depending on what we can access. So there was this focus on creating a New York City identification card, and it was taken up by a bunch of poverty organizations, a bunch of migrant justice organizations, and organizations focusing on trans people, organizations focusing on racism. Really interesting, right? Because in general, those organizations like, working with people who are really harmed by ID systems, most of them are kind of like anti-ID, right? Like, wouldn't it be better if we all didn't have to carry a bunch of papers, right? Like, we all kind of agree, ID, it'd be cool to get rid of it, right? Like surveillance, we're concerned about it. This, this idea of determining who, making people have to be documented, this is bad stuff. But they decided on this strategy because the goal is that it, eliminates barriers for people who can't get ID, right? Or who can't get ID that says who they say they are, right? So it allows people who are undocumented to get this piece of ID that is government ID. You're allowed to self-identify around your gender marker, so you don't have to prove anything about your gender, and you can also leave that field blank, which is just has some flexibility for people who have a hard time with being told this ID is not your ID and all of that. So it was considered in many ways a big victory, but the groups that announced it also talked about some concerns about it. And I want to just show these bottom 2 points are about some of the dilemmas that happen when you're engaged in negotiations around a project like this. So the last one, the NYPD was part of these negotiations, and they said, we won't accept this ID. We won't deal with people with this ID unless you put in there that for 2 years, their records will be kept, their application records will be kept on file, and if we get a court order, we can go get them, right? Does that make sense? So they're like, we want to be able to find out more about these people than what's on their ID. So that's very scary and chilling, right? Because for undocumented people especially, that would potentially reveal more and they could be referred to ICE or something scary like that. So that's something that, people are still trying to get rid of that, but that's something that was negotiated in. That's like, that gives you that feeling, was this a win or not? Like, oh, hard to know. And then the other thing was that's interesting was that was negotiated was a kind of what people called in the media a Tea Party clause, which is that if a Tea Party-like candidate is elected president in the next election, the law that created the ID says that all the records will be destroyed before December 31st, 2016. So because nobody knows if anybody would come in and try to use those to have records of who's undocumented, but that was the fear. So it's interesting just to think about all the moves and counter moves these advocates were dealing with and thinking about as they made this ID. And one of the goals I know socially and formally I've heard is that people are just really trying to get lots of people in New York to get this ID. So it's not just people who have a hard time with other ID who get it, but just that if everybody had the New York City ID, it makes the ID have a different kind of currency. It makes it be more recognized by people you might have to deal with, and it moves it away from being a stigmatized lesser ID right? I'm sure maybe this isn't obvious, but like lots and lots of homeless people, for example, have a really hard time getting ID because you usually need an existing piece of ID to get another piece of ID, right? People coming out of prison often have a really hard time getting a piece of ID. Young people who are out of home or don't have parents often have no documents, and it's hard to start, right? So it's obviously undocumented migrants very much the center of this, but there's a huge range of people who struggle with these ID issues. All very marginalized people struggling to get like basic social services, deal with city buildings, all of that stuff, because not having any ID is super difficult. So this to me is an interesting like example of the kinds of stuff I'm trying to think about. It's easy for us to be like, hate crimes laws kind of don't pass the test, right? Or like things that expand the police do not, in the name of saving trans people, do not pass the test of a non-recuperative reform proposal. But I'm trying to think about like the hard things. Some of the other ones I've been thinking about and researching include the work, a lot of things I'm looking at are at the kind of overlaps and connections between migrant justice, stuff around criminal punishment systems, and stuff around trans populations. Some of the ones I'm interested in, and I also would love to hear other, like if you all have other ideas of things that would be worth researching in this vein, are work that people are doing to reduce the necessity of documentation. So like instead of moving, this is an example, but instead of moving towards trying to get more people to have immigration status, instead trying to reduce the importance of immigration status. So this can be like laws making it so you can get financial aid within a state without being documented, or there's some people doing like negotiations to try to get like sheriffs of certain counties to accept like the Mexican civil ID card as ID instead of having to have people have a US-based ID, things like that. I'm also looking at people working on like increased options for gender on government documents, or for court orders around gender, and the kind of pluses and minuses of that. Who can navigate that? Who can choose it? Is it investing further in a surveillance system, or is it actually reducing the power of that surveillance system? Various reforms that make it easier to change information on your ID. Does that reduce the solidity of ID, or does it increase its, or does it recuperate it? That's like an interesting question. Also looking at, as I live in Seattle, the criminal punishment system is really famous for its diversion programs. It promotes itself as like this really social justice centered, progressive jurisdiction nationally because it has these diversion programs. And it's really complicated to try to analyze these diversion programs because on the one hand, people often end up perhaps not having to go to jail or prison because of the diversion programs. On the other hand, you have to get arrested. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't do anything about the funnel, who gets funneled in through basically being kidnapped by the police, going through these like really violent processes. And so, especially like the youth-centered ones, it's all about like putting social services like in a courthouse. You know what I mean? Like it's all about still subjecting youth of color, low-income youth to the same kind of processes of bringing people in, and kind of all the ways that redounds to the detriment of particular people who are kind of funneled in. So I think looking at kind of all those softer punishment frameworks that are often advocated for by progressives and even by people who are, want to abolish policing in prisons, sometimes advocating for those, but trying to figure out like, which ones are going to like bite us, and which ones are actually a reduction in the system, or are these expansions? Are they reductions? Are they softer, or are they like actually enhanced discretion, enhanced reach of these systems? So that can be like diversion programs, special courts, like drug courts, mental health courts, which I think for the most part people are finding to be failures, and recuperation efforts, work release programs, things like that. Another kind of area of this research for me is like queer or trans units inside prisons and jails. Many jails have had them for a long time. Some are getting rid of them. Some are getting them. Who gets to be in them? How is it decided who counts? The kind of racialized enforcement of who gets determined to be vulnerable. Those are really interesting, very difficult negotiations that lots and lots of people who want to get rid of jails and prisons still have to negotiate now when thinking about vulnerability. So I have some other examples, but I'll just leave you guys with an anti-recuperative image to look at by Chris Vargas that I really enjoy. But yeah, so that's kind of a lot of the work I'm trying to think about is moving deeper into this question of how different social movement intellectual traditions, how different existing organizations have and currently do this evaluation around what's recuperative. And so I'm excited to hear from you all what you think about this, questions you have. If I went through certain things too fast, or if you want to go deeper with some of the examples, I would love to discuss. Oh, I went to the wrong. That was my counterinsurgency slide. Oh. Yes.
Hey, so I'm starting to do some work around preventing um, LAPD body cameras from going into place.
Okay.
And the issue isn't that we are negotiating whether they should be there or not. That's not the issue. The issue is we do have some people who want to do reform, but I'm really not worried about. I'm wondering, experience-wise, what do you think are the processes for one working with the city to de-emphasize that it's a research-based project, and then reallocate those funds most likely to maybe the K through 12 system, but not for increased security? Or would you think that maybe that would still want to push for those funds? It's about $56 million that they want for this research project. So yeah.
The 56 million for the research project about whether or not to implement.
Body cams, yes.
56 million to do the research?
No, the 56 million is
for the cameras.
The cameras.
Okay. Okay.
And so we're trying to figure out right now on where are we going to make our push, what is our ask going to be, and it's about basic state surveillance. And the assumption, we already got rid of the assumption of we're going to reform the cops. Like, no, that just came from one lawyer. Education law, not experience with this.
Yeah, right.
So I'm trying to figure out, well, how are we going to make, first of all, how are we going to disrupt and stop that research from being successful? They're specifically targeting the lowest income area, of course, in Long Beach, and then how can we push for reallocations of funds to more helpful programs that are accessible and not state surveillance or not state funded like police violence.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I was fascinated to see just like, you know, the emergence of the protests in Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, and then Obama right away with the cameras. In Seattle, there was some push around trying to even just have the footage not be usable against defendants, and it failed.
Of course.
It's just like, so it's really interesting to just watch it all unfold. One thing I took out of this presentation is that I've been looking at alongside this is Miriam Kaba's assessment of like kind of how do we assess different police reforms that are emerging, and she has a whole piece like if it's technology focused, it's not going to work. She's really useful. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I think like it can be. It's so local, the context of how to do that, but I think that is the move, and the move of pushing for reallocation is a really smart move. We're doing that in Seattle around this youth jail they want to build for $210 million, and we're like, why don't you give people income support, childcare, all these things instead of building this new youth jail? And I don't actually think that the government can think about the pots of money that way, or like I don't have any lot of beliefs that they are going to reallocate. I think at best we'll just stop it from being built, if that. But that may be different in the context of a municipal government. But that's definitely not. I haven't found that in Seattle. I haven't found the ability to do that. But I love that you're doing that work. I'm sorry I don't have any answers for you about how to do it well here. But I do think it's exactly what we have to do. I mean, that is that assessment of the reform. I mean, I don't know if you saw this. Like, I got this email from the Brennan Center that was like, the prosecutors and sheriffs of the United States have come together and they're going to solve the problems with racism and criminal punishment. You know, it's just like that's the kind of the story we're getting is like they've got this. You guys can just go to sleep. It's cool. Like, you know, like that. And so that is like that's the scary moment that we're in, I feel, where it's like everyone is ready to expand their own power, capacity, and authority by taking our critiques and then producing things like body cameras that will worsen experiences of policed people. So I love that you're doing that work. Thank you. I think that probably takes a lot of direct action. I think that kind of work probably requires a lot of direct action.
Thank you for a lot of work. I've been following you since 2013, which is when my teacher introduced you. By the way, philosophy of law class, not in a kind of
that might be the only time that ever happened.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah.
Really enjoyed your talk and your idea about mainstreaming and preparation, and of course it brings to mind, homo nationalism in
Yes.
work, queerness in politics, in Harrington Horn's work. How can you explain the process of mainstreaming in relation to these two concepts?
Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely. Homo nationalism, yes, that's exactly the term I would use for a lot of this, or pinkwashing is another term people are using, right? The idea of this moment where like the most violent institutions of the U.S. government and corporate institutions as well are like slapping a rainbow flag on their like tank or like pepper spray gun or what, you know what I mean? Like that's literally what's happening in terms of the current push for trans military inclusion is full of that rhetoric. And definitely the rhetoric against Don't Ask, Don't Tell that resulted in like supposed, gay and lesbian people can serve in the U.S. military was all about recuperating the U.S. military, which is like, needs a lot of PR upgrade because of like, look what it does, right? And so part of that is saying this is a dignified job, and we need this important work, and like this whole pro-military framing like granted by like a gay and lesbian rights, formation, and I see that happening now. Oh, that's pretty. With the trans military push, I see the exact same thing happening. So to me, like that is all under the rubric of homonationalism, and that is like one of the terms I would teach to help understand that. And also, I think the piece around homonormativity, that word as well, and the idea of like pitching like a domesticated consumer gay subject as like what it is to have LGBT identity or whatever. Yeah, and I think that the queer necropolitics work really overlaps with that for me in a lot of ways, right? And looking at, in a very basic way, just looking at the production of death, that they can claim to save your life while they enhance the system that is designed to kill you, and that is a really hard idea for people in the United States. I mean, I think we really lack a lens for reading propaganda. That's what I notice. I mean, those gay stickers by the SPD, they really work for people. People are like, oh, I feel included. Even the people who are not going to benefit from that, right, and who wouldn't actually call the police because they're scared of them. There's a sense that it's interesting to think about all the things we can know at once that make propaganda work on us, even while we actually do know more than that. And I see that a lot. And so part of some of my work outside of academia has been like making like videos and films and collaborating with artists to try to make some stuff that helps people read propaganda, because I think that's kind of one of the emergencies that we're in, especially around queer and trans politics right now. Like right now, it is one of the favored ways to cloak state violence, as always is saving women. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm interested in the university as a recruitive force, as a force for that recuperation. I'm just wondering if you have any comments about that.
Yeah. Oh God, I feel like that's like, I mean, as somebody I work at a Jesuit Catholic university that has all the like kind of severe like racial climate problems on campus, and just feeling like even like my existence in the university and my work to try to transform the racial climate, sports students of color, is already recuperative work for the university. I mean, like that is such a dilemma. Like, and like fighting for reforms I don't even believe in sometimes, but they'd just be anything to start, any acknowledgement. I think it's such a dilemma. And also I think more broadly, when you look at big public systems like the UC, like that the university itself is a site of the production of knowledges about like how to best imprison people, how to best, bomb things, how to best develop weapons. I mean that, right? So that how the university is always cast as like this like liberal education project that's so wonderful, when what we know its central work is like occupying this land, like producing like docile workers, producing forms of knowledge that support the status quo. I mean, this is that feeling that we all have, that Eric said it in the introduction, that like it's just like happenstance if you ever get any good ideas there, because that's not what it was made for. You know what I mean? Like the good ideas come from like students doing reading groups on their own and like performing their resistance. It's not, we can't expect to learn to transform the world at a site like that. And that is, but the PR for the university as the place that your mind will be liberated is interesting to put alongside like the PR for the U.S. military as a place that liberates women or gay and lesbian people who get to serve. What it lets us ask Peter Gelderlus's question: what does liberatory mean to you? Is liberatory getting the corporate job, like getting to go be part of ROTC? Like what are you being liberated to? Those are things that I think are challenging for all of us. And I think that we can really practice these questions about reform inside our work to reform the university. And a lot of it's trial and error. I mean, to me, like, I don't have a program. I'm not like sure what we should all do. Of course, that's the whole dilemma. Is like if we can even just get to the part where we debate it, where we stop being like, oh my God, they wrote our name down, we're done. Yes, but if we can get past that and be like, oh wow, now it's really hard. Like now, trying to figure out what's going to happen and what's the counter move going to be, and who's going to get some relief from this, and who's going to get left out, and is this a good deal or a bum deal? Like that's like the juicy, like that's real feminist inquiry, right? That we often don't even get to because we're still stuck at the like, oh my God, they represented us, they put our name on something, So I think that those dilemmas exist in the university for me just as much as they exist in my dilemmas at the site of criminal punishment reform policy work. And also that work is happening on our campuses because we're asking questions about like the cops on our campuses. Like it's all happening here as well. Yeah, it's a great question.
In my experience, I'm an adjunct lecturer
Uh-huh.
at a little university at Cal State San Bernardino.
Yeah.
And I just keep thinking about how, I don't know how to put it, but this idea of trying to
Yeah.
And that I don't know if there's a chilling effect where they feel like they cannot do that, or if it's, but they really believe in the procedural knowledge,
Yeah.
I guess. And so it just really makes me feel like I'm in like I'm in a test place.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
One
trying
of
to figure out how to dismantle, because every time we try to dismantle, then it gets recuperated.
Yeah.
You know, like we're agitating for noticing some of the most vulnerable people on our campus, but they just hired this guy to be our diversity officer for like $1 zillion.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's done nothing, I think, but get dressed in suits and
Right.
talk to other people in suits.
And be the last like I think they always hire that person who they want to be the like the dead end. They just like hire a dead end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean I think that's the thing. It's like we're all in that. I mean what we can do is Gelderloos says we just need to face that we're in a social war. So it changes it when you're just like, oh yeah, it's warfare. Of course there's going to be move counter move, right? Like of course we have to like endlessly be creative and realize the thing we used to do doesn't work, and like notice. I think that's really useful. And I work in a law school, and it's like the entire thing is a recuperative project for the U.S. legal system, the U.S. government, right? So like literally, my school is the most like racially diverse of the law schools in our very white region in the Northwest, and every black student who's brought into the school is recruited to try. People are trying to get them to be a prosecutor. The prosecution needs people of color, and especially black people, to be its face. The head of the Black Alumni Law Association of our school is a prosecutor. And I have sat with so many black students who I met like maybe in their second or third year, and they were like, I came here to dismantle the system, basically. And I've spent all last summer interning at the prosecutor's office, and all this summer, and now my whole resume is prosecutor. And I keep being told that I can use prosecutorial discretion to like help my communities, but it's not true. It's a factory. Everyone's going to get prosecuted, and like. You know what I mean? So you see the people who are milled through this system, these students who like are working so hard to have their purpose utterly thwarted by the school, which has a student association called Prosecutors for Social Justice, and is like literally promotes prosecution as a social justice career. And every mayor of Seattle is like, I'm for social justice. We're going to hire more police. I mean, this is just like, so to me, Seattle is kind of like a really like advanced place of this kind of neoliberal recuperation rhetoric where everything is used. It's pretty sophisticated. It's like they have an office of race and civil rights. I mean, like they've they really like use all the words to do the same thing that's happening in every neoliberal city of like, sweeping homeless people, imprisoning people. So I think it's like interesting to see how we are being put as trainers of professionals, and like also how do they get us to do that? Like how do they get our colleagues and us to like how do they make us shut up? How do they produce cultures in which people will do that training who know better, who once knew better? That's another question for us, I think. Like how do we transform the cultures of universities to be spaces in which people can re-remember what they maybe once were passionate about or knew but has been trained out, and how is that different than other moments in US history where student activism created different campus climates, I think is a question. Yeah.
So when you're mentioning like getting trapped in this system of like interning a prosecutor and like going against my original like dream of doing this sort of thing like forever, like what would be your advice like going to law school to prevent those sorts of like getting trapped in like the system of trying to be pushed towards being a prosecutor or something that wouldn't be at all contributing to the social justice that I want to get involved in?
Yeah. Well, one of the dilemmas is that it's really easy to see how the prosecutor like does evil, but it's also true that there isn't a legal role that isn't being the front lines of the system. So also when I'm helping somebody like not get evicted or get their welfare check or whatever, I'm still just the frontline recuperation of a system that's trying to kill poor people and people of color that has, 10 lawyers or whatever, or 100, so that 1 in every 600 people who need this help get it, but only if they have the best case, which usually means they're the person who doesn't have a criminal record, who has the rent arrears, who has documentation, right? So like already the role of a lawyer, of a social justice lawyer, is pretty much solely a recuperative role. And additionally, the ways that legal services are provided are so siloed from social movement work that actually builds power that it's like, you have all these people coming to you, they're all being evicted because like the neighborhood's being gentrified or whatever, and you're supposed to just see them as individuals. You're not supposed to get them together. You're not supposed to organize a rent strike with them. You're not supposed to say we're going to like break laws to transform what's happening, and we're going to not, you know, because there's no legal relief for them. Like being poor, you lose. Like that's actually pretty much the deal. Like discriminating against poor people will never be illegal in the United States because it's capitalism, right? Like they can kick you out of your house. And so, and the shreds of any like tenants' rights or welfare rights, I mean, those things are just like almost non-existent. So the question really for me is like, why go to law school? Like that is a real question for me, because there will always be people who will go to law school and do those jobs because law school is like elite and people's parents like it and stuff like that. So so if you have like a more radical politics, I would encourage another route, because we have people who will go and do that always because it's elite, right? And but it's kind of a political dead end. I mean, we need radicalized people who often lay lawyers like and who will like transform legal knowledge about legal systems and how they work and get them out into communities, not keep them in legal offices where very few people can access it, right? We need some of that, but I don't know that that's actually best done by lawyers traditionally. And I think what we really need is, like, if you really want to change conditions, you have to build enough power that the thing can't be sustained, and that will never happen with legal cases. Like, justice will never come from US courts or from legislatures. I mean, it's just not possible. Even when you win the win, they don't enforce the law. I mean, it's just like unbelievable, right? So that's I'm very cautious about whether or not people should go to law school, because I think often the thing they think they'll get out of it is based on the illusions we have about legal reform in the United States. And that I want people who want to transform the world to not get caught up in 3 years of extreme like debt and extreme socialization. That kind of actually disempowers you from what you already knew was true usually. And we all can be like, no, my visions and beliefs are so strong, it won't happen to me. But it's really immersive. So I like huge caution about that for people who want to change the world, which doesn't mean, obviously I'll support you forever if you do it, you know, and whatever you do. But like, it's not, you know, it's not a judgment, but it's just, I have that fear that some people with big ideas get lost in there. And it's pretty hard to maintain your big ideas with your, you know, $200,000 debt load and all that stuff. So yeah, I think that, you know, we need to critique prosecution, but we need to critique poverty law like the same amount. Yeah.
What avenues would you suggest then if not going to law school? Because I'm like, I want to go to law school and I want to like jack up the system and like do something different and like help people out, give like legal advice to people. But like, what other avenues would you suggest to go down to you know, do something that's actually substantial?
Yeah.
And not like soul killing, you know?
Yes, that's such a good question to ask. I love it. Yes. So this is the thing. So there's a lot of different things people do to try to enact social change. A lot of them are not paid. Like, you're probably not going to get paid by the man to like destroy him. You know what I'm saying? It really sucks, you know? But it's a brutal reality. So I think like a lot of it, first of all, is just like all of us have to try a million strategies so we can see what we're good at, what we like. So it could be that like it's poetry. It could be that it's like making fierce propaganda. It could be that it's like that you're good at like sabotaging sites where they're building jails. It could be that you're good at like you know, supporting people who've just been through trauma. It could be that you're really good at like designing the best way for us to like create community housing when people are losing housing and the shelters aren't safe for people. Like, I don't know. There's so many things that need to be done. It's unbelievable, you know? And so I think a lot of what we should be doing is trying a bunch of stuff and working with existing groups. Like, I think a lot of my students, they want to make change, but there's obstacles for them around like just like joining the groups that are doing stuff in their region and seeing what people do and trying to find mentors and like just taking those risks of being with people who are different from us, or like joining a group being like, I don't know anyone, I'm just going to go to their meeting and like see what's what. I mean, this region is full of like some of the most mind-blowingly awesome activism happening in the United States. Like, that's really like Southern California is an amazing space to try to change stuff. There's so many thoughtful projects happening. So to me, getting involved in stuff and figuring out what you love to do and like what you're good at, and then finding ways to either get paid doing that or get paid doing as little work as possible somewhere else to do the thing you want to do. You know what I mean? Like, you know, like my job as a law professor is not my vocation. It's my job. You know what I mean? I get paid and I do, you know, it's great. I don't really have a boss. I only have to be there a certain number of hours a week. You know what I mean? It's good. Like, looking for the hustle, you know, is like the thing. And that is really different from the story that you've all been given, which is like you'll have a social justice career and become a social justice entrepreneur, these kinds of horrible phrases that are neoliberal. Like, no, like that's there's a fantasy in our country that like the right person is gonna like graduate from Harvard Business School and they're gonna like think of how to end poverty. It's never gonna happen. Poverty is gonna end when the critical numbers of poor people like make it impossible for rich people to stay rich, right? Like that's, you know what I mean? So it's a really, like, so we have to kind of think about movements in that way. And for me, a lot of this is about being like a lifetime student of existing and historical social movements here and around the world to be like, what do people do? Why? What happened next? What was the counter move? Would that work here? Why is that hard here? Why did that work in this city but not in this rural place and this time and not that, like nobody knows what's gonna fix it. Like we've all been trying forever since the beginning of like, oppression, right? And so we don't know. And we also don't know if we're all gonna survive, right? Like it's just like we don't know if climate chaos is gonna beat our social movements to the finish line, right? So it's pretty like dark, intense times, right? So to me, that's why we have to be like rigorous students of what people are trying and become fascinated by that, which means like when I'm doing the dishes, I'm listening to the documentary about it. When I, you know what I mean? Like becoming obsessed, like people feel about Justin Bieber, but about, is that even relevant anymore? I don't know. But about how social change works and what it has to do with things I might know how to do with small groups of people, with big groups of people. And even if you end up getting some kind of, jobby job, like forever doing unpaid grassroots work, because that's where the really important work happens. And when you lose like your footing there and your accountability to that, inevitably like you're owned by something, whether it's like the funder who funds the nonprofit, like that's setting the agenda. So we have to like, that's another part of this, how to produce practices where like you get your energy and your life and your sense of self, not from the space where you get paid or graded. It's pretty huge for all of us, That's not the track we're being put on. It's not what we've been told is successful, but we already know from everything we're talking about, they lie about what's a victory and what's a success, including personal path, right? So I think that's a lot of it. It's like shaking off whatever you were told was the way to change the world by like somebody, like of course the university wants you to go to law school, let's go for the university, or you know what I mean? Like, but what do you think changes stuff? And what do you like to do? Like, do you like filling out forms? Because that's what lawyers do, Do you like telling people, no, I can't help you? That's what most lawyers do. You know what I mean? Do you like, I don't know, like working with color and glitter? I don't know, like that. These are the questions. That's what I like to do. Or like working in groups of people, or like hacking. I mean, there's just so many. We need it all, So, like cooking. I mean, we need all childcare. We need so much of this stuff. So I think that's the question: is how do we like actually stay passionate on a path instead of professionalization, which is usually like the reverse, kind of deadening. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just struck when you were talking about relief reaching only the least marginalized. It sounded very much like development policy. So I was wondering, what happens if you try to sort of transnationalize this?
Mm-hmm.
And might that be actually very fruitful?
Mm.
Because I think it's the same project, if you think about neoliberal globalization and the financialization of poor people and all kinds of policies involving Monsanto and so on and so forth, green revolutions.
Yeah, I feel like this is actually better understood everywhere than the United States. Like some of these illusions we're under about what U.S. law could do, or that we could be social justice entrepreneurs, I don't know if they're held in the same way everywhere, because most of the, like for example, the critique of the nonprofit industrial complex that we've seen take hold here in the last decade or so, where people are finally understanding the ways that like philanthropy influences what social movements can do and actually like caps them and funds non-transformative strategies, and while transformative strategies are criminalized, like that's been understood by people looking at the problems with international aid. For there's nothing like, right, that's not rocket science. People who've been seeing like governments like the United States and wealthy corporations try to influence, and open markets through aid, right? So I feel like in some ways, the U.S. hears some of these critiques last, right? Or when I look at, movements in other places that are happening in contexts where there actually is a large autonomous grassroots, we have these like siloed nonprofits that do stuff, and they're competing with each other for funding, and the strategies are not people power based. Like the power piece is missing. There's very little mass based organizing. It's all like professionals in an office. They're gonna come up with the answer. That is really different than than people who have a big movement. And out of the movement, they're creating a health clinic. Out of the movement, they're creating a school. Like that's just. So I think we're in the belly of the beast in a particular way. We have a particular set of like difficulty seeing certain things and problems conceptualizing certain things that I don't know if those same gaps are this. I think that maybe the gaps of elites everywhere, but I think that. When I taught at Harvard Law School, there was this student who came to me when we read the stuff about the nonprofit industrial complex critique and said, yeah, I go every year with this group of Harvard students. They send a group every year. We all go to India and we work with this nonprofit. We work with one of these nonprofits and we produce this report. And they have this stack of these reports on all their desks that say like the problem. Here's the problem with getting this thing, or people are having this problem. And it's like, if we all just gave our airfare to these organizations instead of going and writing this useless report with our brilliant Harvard minds that are so much more expertise than the people who live there who know they don't have the thing, And one of the other questions that I'm asking in this new work is about data collection. This is a very risky thing to talk about in academia, but I think data collection itself can be a recuperative approach that needs to actually be analyzed. Not only because we know that data collection methods often constitute populations and describe problems in ways that reify racial and gender and settler norms, but also because of that dynamic where you're like, there's a problem, trans people are being abused in prisons, and they're like, show us the data. You're like, and then we'll do something. They're not going to do something if you show them the data. And there's a million reasons you can't have the data. It's like you need a movement to force them to do something. The data won't do, there's kind of some belief in data like belief in law. And it's really fetishized in the university and in social science and policy. So some of my questions coming from that, kind of those students with their Harvard report that they leave on the desk at this nonprofit in India, I'm just kind of curious about if we can, that student was so brilliant because she was seeing her own work as recuperating Harvard. You know what I mean? She was seeing that this wasn't actually for this group in India. It was to give Harvard students this experience and make Harvard look like something in particular, instead of this broader, actually, how would change happen for the conditions the report are about? Very unlikely from Harvard students visiting and writing a report. So I think that some of these critiques are understood in some ways better outside the U.S. Because a lot of the institutions that most need recuperation are yeah. Yeah. And it's why refusal is such an interesting strategy right now, right? Like Black Lives Matter folks, others refusing to endorse a candidate. Refusal is a boycott and refusal, two strategies that we see emerging in lots of different movements right now. They're really interesting strategies because they're ways of resisting recuperation. They're like, no, we won't negotiate. We won't create a set of demands that you can then fake appease. There's a refusal of concessions, which can be an interesting way to deal with the problems of recuperation. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
And as you certainly I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the things that you're talking about can be better than other places. And I'm wondering how much that has to do with some of particularly the mass poverty, and combined with the lack of that whole individual, preoccupation that we have. I mean, it's so ingrained. I know those of us that teach social justice, or we try to bring the students together to do something, even to do a group project. It's like, I'm the individual. And that is, other places, they're not as obsessed. And then even if they want to be, sometimes the more poverty and more youth, the more difficult it is to be that.
That's interesting.
And in the university, no matter how disadvantaged you are, you're an elite level. So some of this, processing, I wonder how much that just gets in our way. People, you learn all these things, you want to go change things, you want to do this, but you're the most individual process, the least person to be doing that. And I think that it's causing us to stumble.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know enough. It's hard for me to say anything generally about other places, but I totally see what you're saying about the ways even university education is marketed as this very individualized path, and then the ways stories about social change are told in the United States are Martin Luther King, an individual; Rosa Parks, an individual; also Oprah. If you can dream it, you can do it. It's a very individualized story, and those kind of deeply inaccurate accounts of social change are what most of us came up with. And a lot of them center law, interestingly. A lot of them center law reform as like the thing that was won and discourage us from looking at the conditions that occurred after the law reform was successfully won. So I think that's something, it's like, how do we fight these truths in our own psychologies in order to participate in movements and notice them as narratives circulating culturally, and notice them as narratives of recuperation that prop up, right? Like, well, if Oprah can become rich, then the United States must not be racist. Like those, they recuperate the entire system, right? Like Brown versus Board of Education is a recuperation project for the U.S., as is the Obama presidency, as is Oprah's, fame and wealth. You know what I mean? Like whatever. Like every time the United States tries to say to itself, anti-black racism is over, right? So I think that individualism is like very core to that, and like the inability to. I noticed this because of like attachments. So, some of the work I teach, is, I know you're learning from other people here as well, is like some of the critiques of the same-sex marriage, legal reform strategy, and the ways in which it centers various forms of like whiteness and wealth and property. And one of the things that happens is some of my students are just like, they're with me on all the critical ideas, and then we get to same-sex marriage, which has been a really big recuperative project while they've been alive, and they're super emotionally attached to it. So they're straight, but they're like, love wins. You know what I mean? Like they feel it. They're like, they can picture. They're like, yeah, because they were gonna lose their kids. They're just like, they've got some individual story in their mind that makes them suddenly unable to think strategically about how this might relate to like broader social movement trends, to neoliberalism, to the role of marriage in managing race and wealth in the United States. To and it's interesting how anecdote can undo our critical capacities, especially when we have an emotional attachment we've been giving to that anecdote. And especially romantic attachment. Two service members kissing in uniform. Maybe the military is amazing. You know what I mean? Like the propaganda is wild. It's really wild. Like, what is it we need to see to suddenly forget everything we know? I think individual stories are often that. I really experienced that in the classroom a lot. Yeah. 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 It's a really interesting moment. Eric and I were talking about this before. So obviously, like the bathroom issue is something that I've been working on for a really long time, right? It's a really intense site of vulnerability, especially for people who are like low-income people of color, homeless people. Like the people who are most likely to be policed are those people. The narrative that's happening out in the media, of course, is centering like white students. I don't know if you guys have seen these like memes that are like, that'll have like a really passing white trans person and be like, would you kick this person out of the bathroom? So there's a lot of stuff that does that deserving, undeserving figures, circulates, this conditional acceptance. We're seeing all that's very painful to me to see that. Very sad, very transphobic, racist things that are being circulated in the name of supporting trans people's access to bathrooms. Obviously, it's a horrifying, legal regime. Trans people already get arrested all the time for using bathrooms. I've been arrested for using the bathroom. So it's not as if things were cool until this law, which is just, right? Like it's not as if you have to break any law for the police to arrest you. I hope you all know that, like police don't know what the law is. But so it's interesting to watch this happen. And I do see this in part, to me, this in part affirms what I've long felt about backlashes. I feel like what happens is, elite reform strategies are brought out by people who are the elite of the marginalized group, and then the backlash, redounds to the detriment of people on the bottom. So that is something that concerns me about this story in the same way I was concerned about that with Prop 8, coming out of that like useless lawsuit about the name of marriage in California. That really is an elite concern. But the other thing that Eric and I were talking about was that at the same time, some people we know who really generally have pretty like scary politics now are like care about trans people's rights to use the bathroom. So there's this weird thing where like you can know someone who's like a Trump supporter but thinks that trans people should backlashes produce weird media moments, right? That don't evoke a thorough commitment to justice, but different kinds of reactionary, like, you know what I mean? And I think mostly this is a very dangerous moment for trans people, that this mostly ramps up surveillance and produces even higher levels of vulnerability for the most marginalized trans people using public space. So I'm mostly concerned about that. One of the kind of inherent critiques in this work is that visibility is like, we're told visibility is a good thing. Visibility is not. like, right, like what's being made visible, who's being valorized, who's being considered still dangerous, still disposable, still undeserving, and how does just more visibility, like there's stories from years ago of like people trying to train different police forces, like 10 years ago around trans access, and the cops would then know better how to find trans people and arrest them. Like, they recognize you better. You know what I mean? Like, there's like for certain really marginalized populations that kind of can't win in the public arena, it's better if people think about us less. You know what I mean? I think that's an interesting dilemma. So yeah, I think there's a lot to this moment, and I think it is, for me, again, a chance to think about like the ways that recuperative reforms like produce backlash. I've been having this debate with this guy who's promoting like the trans in the military stuff, and one of the things I've said is like, I think if this becomes a really big public campaign, there'll be so much backlash against trans people. Before this whole the North Carolina thing happened, I was like, there'll be backlash around bathrooms, showers, all the things that freak people out about the military because it's about living together. Like those red herrings around trans people will come to the surface. They've come to the surface anyway now, before the military thing became like a very big public story. But like we could predict this and say this is going to be really vulnerable making. What are all the consequences? But instead, it's like usually like, certain organizations like that are like big organizations, they just want to claim victories in the New York Times and get more grants. Like they don't think about like backlash to like low-income people, people of color, homeless people, because that's not their constituency. So I think one of the questions is just like what's ethical and unethical about these pieces of reform that produce backlashes. But I don't really hear much talk about that yet. But I think that if we like in 10 years when we look at Prop 8 and we look at this this North Carolina moment, we might be able to have an account of that. Yeah. I think I said I'd let people go at 5:30 because a lot of people have class and stuff. So thank you so much.